The most disturbing truths don't require security clearances to access. They're in your local library, your museum's storage room, and sometimes in your grandmother's photo album. Welcome to In Plain Sight, where today's investigation proves that the US government didn't hide psychic espionage, they just counted on nobody connecting the dots. The investigation leads us to two facts that cannot both be true. Fact 1. Controlled clairvoyance doesn't work. The literature says it fails under operational conditions. Fact 2. In 1989, from a room in Maryland, Angela Della Fiora Ford wrote down a place that wasn't on her brief, Lowell, Wyoming. And days later, U.S. Customs arrested the fugitive Charles Jordan near Lovell, Wyoming. Yet both are documented. Both are real. The case files and interviews outline a Cold War program with rotating code names: Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Stargate, training civilians to remote view distant targets under blind tasking, while the public record arrives scarred with black ink where the methods and evaluation tables should be. She wasn't psychic. Not exactly. She was trained by the US government, and she wasn't the only one. The question isn't whether Stargate existed. It's why the pages that would settle its value still don't. The investigation into Stargate begins not with that impossible discovery, but 2 decades earlier, in a suburban Californian research institute, where a pair of Stanford physicists was about to stumble upon something that would lead to that Wyoming desert arrest. No one could have predicted that a routine research contract would eventually force the Defense Intelligence Agency to confront a truth they'd spent years trying to suppress. The investigation into Angela Ford does not begin with that contradiction of Lowell versus Lovell, but a few years earlier, in a windowless room at Fort Meade, Maryland. This is where a handful of civilians and soldiers were being trained to describe places they were not allowed to visit and people they were never meant to meet. The rules were sparse by design: minimal tasking, no leading details, blind targets whenever possible. The names of the unit shifted like code words in a shell game: Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Stargate. Yet the work remained stubbornly the same: sit still, quiet the noise, and write what comes. The Cold War supplied the pressure, and the bureaucracy supplied the forms. The experiment, however one chooses to classify it, left a paper trail thick with redactions and uneasy results. Her presence there is not a rumor. Slowly, with a heavy tone, it is documented. Official interviews and broadcast accounts identify Angela Della Fiora Ford as a remote viewer assigned to find hostages, fugitives, and objects from that building at Fort Meade. Years later, when asked if she had been hired as a psychic spy, she laughed and allowed the point. In the same breath, she explained that her assignment was simply to locate, to describe, to aim the mind where a camera couldn't go. And in one session in 1989, she spoke a place that was not on her briefing: Lowell, Wyoming, spelled carefully. Days later, US Customs arrested the target near Lovell, Wyoming. These details come to us not as barstool folklore, but in on-camera testimony and network copy that can be checked and scrubbed, line by line. If this were only a legend, the legend would not survive contact with the evaluation files. When the government hired outside reviewers in 1995 to examine the program's research and operations, the verdict was both clinical and uneasy. With conviction, the American Institutes for Research gathered user interviews, scoring tables, and narrative debriefs, and concluded that while remote viewing narratives sometimes contained accurate fragments, they were, without exception, not specific enough to warrant retasking other intelligence assets. In short, intriguing, but operationally thin. And yet, the paradox lingers. The same history features a case, Angela Ford's Wyoming call, that refuses to lie flat under the weight of statistical hand-waving. Mainstream summaries of the program now included as one of the incidents that kept analysts from closing the ledger and moving on. The History Channel's long-form treatment of Project Stargate points to Ford's 1989 tasking and the Lowell-Lovell echo, while reminding us that in 2017, the CIA released millions of pages touching the program's long arc from SRI in California to Fort Meade in Maryland. The record is not tidy, the redactions are not polite, but the bones of the story are anchored in public archives, not whispers. To approach this with scholarly honesty, the evidence has to be stratified, with authority. Primary sources are the declassified evaluation materials and agency records, the AIR report with its interviews and missing tables. Secondary sources are the on-record testimonies, broadcast interviews where dates, names, and spellings can be parsed. Tertiary sources are the histories that synthesize, contextualize, and at times, editorialize. Each tier has a different weight, and none is sufficient on its own. The Wyoming incident, for instance, sits awkwardly at the seam between a televised anecdote and a now routine historical summary, useful enough to be cited, slippery enough to frustrate the strictest statisticians. What then of Angela Ford herself? Beyond the single arrest that made her a perennial footnote, program veterans and researchers have discussed her publicly, placing her within the Fort Meade cadre that worked operational tasks across roughly 9 years. In one curated interview, physicist Edwin May, who ran parts of the government's program in its later years, described Ford as an intelligence analyst with decades inside the community, 9 of them spent in the remote viewing unit. It is not an occult resume, but a bureaucratic one, rendered in the dry jargon of agencies that prefer function to theater. That contrast between the prosaic job title and the extraordinary tasking defines the tone of the entire archive. Even the program's skeptics, when they write for the record, have to navigate that same tonal dissonance. The independent evaluation commissioned at the end of the Cold War did not simply wave the subject away. It counted, coded, and complained in the language of requirements and resources. It said, with bureaucratic impatience, that the products were too vague, that they did not reliably drive decisions, that they required too much interpretive labor from analysts already drowning in data. And yet the very existence of those interviews and scoring rubrics implies something rarely said out loud. Users kept tasking the unit because, at least occasionally, something in the noise felt like signal. But what was this signal? Where did it come from? And why did the government invest so much in a phenomenon they claimed was a failure? To understand that, we must go back to the beginning. They came for a delusion. What they found was a nationwide experiment in psychic espionage. In the early 1970s, scientific curiosity collided with Cold War paranoia at the Stanford Research Institute. It was here, led by physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, that a concept was born. They called it remote viewing, the idea that a human mind could perceive hidden or distant targets without any sensory input. These early experiments drew the attention of US intelligence when, as legend has it, one viewer described a hidden Soviet installation with unnerving accuracy. The ghost of Project Stargate quietly slipped into the lexicon, and by 1977, the US Army formally put the program under a single roof at Fort Meade, Maryland. They christened it Grill Flame, a name that would evolve through Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally, Stargate. The Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, envisioned remote viewing as an asset, gatherable, silent, inexpensive, capable of penetrating enemy territory without crossing a border or risking a life. By the mid-1980s, the remote viewing cadre numbered only 15 to 20 people, a tight-knit unit of civilians and soldiers trained in blind target protocols, sensory sketches, and coordinate-based sessions. They worked under Commanding Officer Lieutenant Frederick Holmes, Skip Atwater, in a program that became intertwined with the Monroe Institute, a research organization straddling the spiritual and military spheres. The sessions were meticulously structured. An interviewer framed a target, a monitor controlled the session, and the viewer quietly described what came to mind: landscapes, colors, even emotional impressions. The aim was operational value, clear evidence of unseen reality. But what the documents show was often vagueness, ambiguity, or outright error. Behind the scenes, institutional tension grew. The program received $20 million in funding over 2 decades, and yet it became a prime target for skeptical science. Evaluations by critics like Ray Hyman called the data inconsistent and operationally useless. Even as advocates like Dr. Jessica Utz argued some patterns suggested psi might exist. A 1995 review by the American Institutes for Research concluded that no remote viewing report had ever delivered actionable intelligence. Slightly more emphatic. And yet, the program wasn't ended immediately. It was transferred, reclassified, renamed, and quietly kept alive until 1995 when the CIA declassified its files. Amid all this, dissenting voices whispered about anomalies, a few sessions that yielded uncomfortably accurate data, enough to keep policymakers from shutting the doors, until bureaucratic patience wore thin. This is the stage that was set for Angela Ford. She stepped into this labyrinth not as a fringe mystic, but as a trained intelligence analyst using a program defined by structure, secrecy, and paradox. What follows isn't fantasy. It's a Cold War intelligence experiment that dared to measure the mind, and almost recorded the espionage equivalent of a miracle. Fort Meade's sanctum was not just a hobbyist salon. In 1989, Angela Della Fiora Ford, a trained intelligence analyst masquerading as a remote viewer, was asked to find Charles Jordan, a U.S. Customs agent turned fugitive. She wasn't given a name or a dossier. She only had a session template, a blind tasking. She closed her eyes. She wrote Lowell, Wyoming. No Lovell, but Lowell. Days later, U.S. Customs agents arrested Jordan near Lovell, Wyoming, less than 100 miles away. She had described the wrong spelling, yes, but she had the right place. And yet the declassified materials refused to tell us whether she knew more, or whether her accuracy came by mind or coincidence. Multiple viewers ran sessions during that case. Amateur sources list roughly 19 sessions with 5 remote viewers contributing. Angela participated in only 2. In those sessions, others placed Jordan in Mexico or South Florida. One even dowsed toward Minnesota. But Angela's, Lowell stood out, singular, otherworldly accurate. One of Angela's sessions occurred 2 months later and was prompted by an independent eyewitness placing Jordan in Yellowstone Park. Asked to describe his movements, she indicated he was traveling west of Lovell toward campsite areas. A chilling echo. Jordan was found in a campsite, not at Lowell, not at Yellowstone Park, but close enough in wilderness pattern, and captured the same day. When asked years later about that Lowell-Lovell moment, Angela smiled. My boss asked me, "Where is Charles Jordan?" I said, "The man is in Lowell, Wyoming," she told CBS News. Moments later, agents were calling to report, "As we are speaking, we are apprehending Charles Jordan 100 miles west of Lovell." "So you were right?" "We were right," she said. Here's the rub. If this were a fluke, Fort Meade would have closed shop behind embarrassment, but it didn't. Agency staff continued tasking, training, briefing, reviewing. Perhaps because that anomaly didn't feel random. Because even the skeptics years later admitted they didn't have an easy answer. But normal channels don't explain it. The only explanation we have is bounded in the documents, not full transcripts, not follow-up analyses, not comparative scoring. Instead, we have a pencil spelling Lowell, an arrest report, and a smudged file missing entire evaluation tables. We have an operational success beyond statistical expectation being brushed into the margins of bureaucratic process. Too embarrassing to extol, too persistent to ignore. The Charles Jordan case stands as both anomaly and anchor. It's anecdote, and yet it informed the decision-makers. When the American Institutes for Research evaluated Project Stargate in 1995, they judged remote viewing not useful, too vague, subjective, and operationally unreliable. Slowly, with a hint of conviction. And yet, they couldn't ignore cases like Ford's. That tension lived on in the fine print. Intriguing. Fragments, but insufficient for tasking. A compromise between empirical demand and the unsettling must-be-something sense that Ford's Lowell moment left behind. She was no fringe mystic. Angela Ford was a DIA analyst assigned to fusion rooms, sitting under infrared lights, practicing written remote viewing. Her identification of Charles Jordan placed her among the few, perhaps one, who delivered a named location before the agents did. The program that contained her was not fringe. It was funded, repeated, studied extensively. It ended not with denials, but with an uneasy handshake between statistical skepticism and unexplained accuracy. And the question remains less about belief, more about the system that lets someone slip through the logic and land where she did. Lowell, Wyoming, or Lovell. She was almost certainly wrong by spelling, but right by miles. We can't reconstruct precisely how or why, but we can trace the lines she left behind in redacted files and hushed interviews. And from there, we must follow the signal. Even after Angela Ford's singular Lowell-Lovell alignment, the broader archive of remote viewing sessions reads less like a wartime success and more like a procedural tangle of hits and misses. The American Institutes for Research, AIR, assessment in 1995 stands as the clearest institutional reckoning after reviewing narrative transcripts, interview logs, and evaluation tables. The panel concluded that no remote viewing report was ever concretely actionable. In other words, some impressions landed near the target, but not consistently enough to justify risking people, drones, or dollars. The report doesn't dismiss Spies entirely, but its wording, intriguing fragments, operationally insufficient, carries the weight of bureaucratic exhaustion, not denial, but underwhelmed. In raw numbers, remote viewing sessions during the program's lifespan numbered in the low thousands, with correct or near-correct geographic matches far fewer, perhaps single-digit percentages. Internal memos estimated that roughly 5 to 15% of sessions contained anything resembling usable intelligence. The rest produced vague landscapes, oceans, or empty fields. But because the Cold War posture demanded any potential edge, any reliability at all, the operation continued, quietly, for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was also experimenting with psychic phenomena, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, raising the stakes. US policymakers didn't commission Stargate because they believed fortune-telling would work. They did so to ensure they weren't missing a Soviet advantage. Historian Jim Schnabel, in Remote Viewers, details how concern about Soviet sci-tech fused with compartmentalized curiosity into funding that, at least on paper, looked defensive rather than credulous. That Cold War paranoia helped rationalize budgets that otherwise lacked empirical justification. Skeptical voices, psychologists like Ray Hyman and Emily Rosa, wrote that remote viewing protocols lacked controls, were vulnerable to confirmation bias, and occasionally read like cold reading, dressed as intelligence gathering. In Hyman's words, PSI has not yielded unequivocal, repeatable, operational performance under laboratory or real-world conditions. Yet even his critics admit anomalies exist. The question was never whether all sessions fail, but whether enough succeed to be meaningful. And at that threshold, Stargate faltered. During congressional oversight hearings in the 1990s, AIR's peers testified that no remote viewing incident had prevented a hijacking, located a missing plane, or stopped a nuclear threat. To the agencies involved, the mind as sensor remained a fascinating side note. The judgment wasn't that Ford's Lowell alignment was hallucination. It was that it was too rare and too ambiguous to rely on, and the program finally closed in 1995, not in thunderous rejection, but in an unceremonious disappearance of budget lines and civilian contracts. No press release heralded the verdict, just silence, and yet, the black-inked files remain. The sections on evaluation methods are still redacted. Targeting procedures, scoring metrics, analytical rubrics, all withheld. The declassified documents include agency memos calling remote viewing not currently useful, but the pages explaining how that scale was structured? Gone. Those blank spaces aren't proof. They're invitation. Spaces where interpretation meets reality. They force a confrontation with the central paradox. This was officially studied, funded, and rationalized, but it still feels like something that should have been faked, except their own process suggests they expected it to work. A Cold War experiment that produced odd precision, consistently failed to scale, and closed not with a declaration, but with same office inertia. Meanwhile, the questions it opened, about the boundaries of perception, about intelligence gathering, and about the irreducibility of the human mind, remain quietly, powerfully unresolved. In 1989, Angela Ford sat in a small room in Maryland, sketching impressions of a man she'd never met. Across the country, thousands of miles away, law enforcement would later confirm a location eerily close to what she had written. That single case stands like a bright pinprick on the dark map of Project Stargate, an anomaly against a background of statistical noise. If the American Institutes for Research report is to be believed, such moments were rare, perhaps too rare to justify the cost or the secrecy. But the program's 2-decade lifespan, its layered code names, and its network of trained viewers tell a different story. That for nearly 20 years, official channels were willing to explore the idea that consciousness might stretch beyond the skull, that minds might touch distant places without the body moving an inch. Was Ford's success an extraordinary coincidence? A disciplined act of attention honed by months of training? Or evidence of something science can't yet measure? The skeptics will point to confirmation bias and chance alignments. The believers will point to the coordinates, the sketches, and the after-action reports. Between them lies a space as blank and as charged as the redacted pages still locked away. Project Stargate closed in 1995, its rooms emptied, its contracts dissolved. But the questions it raised have never gone back into the file cabinet. Private researchers still run remote viewing experiments. Intelligence agencies, both friendly and adversarial, are still rumored to explore human perception in ways that blur the line between psychology and physics. And maybe that's the quiet legacy of Stargate. Not proof, not debunking, but a persistent whisper in the intelligence world that there are ways of seeing we don't yet understand. Angela Ford's session remains a data point in an unfinished chart, one that might someday be filled in. Until then, the coordinates are missing. The target is unseen, and the view, whatever it is, remains on the other side of closed eyes.